Vladimir Lenin was born on April 22, 1870, in the city of Simbirsk, which is over 700 kilometers east of Moscow, the Russian capital. His father, Ilya Nikolaevich Ulyanov, was born in Russia in 1831 to a serf family. In his youth, he gained his freedom and went on to study physics and mathematics at Kazan University. He went on to have a successful career as an educator and public school overseer in Russia. He later became a state councillor, which raised the Ulyanovs' social status in Russia because of Ilya's efforts in public education. Vladimir's mother was Maria Alexandrovna Blank, with a mix of German, Swedish, Russian, and Jewish ancestry. Maria and Ilya had a total of 8 children, but sadly lost 2 of them as infants. Vladimir was the third oldest sibling in the family. He enjoyed a comfortable upbringing, thanks to his father's increasing prosperity. As an example, the Ulyanovs had a cozy home in Simbirsk and also enjoyed vacations at a countryside manor in Kokushkino. From a young age, Vladimir displayed exceptional intelligence and talent in academics and chess, indicating great promise. However, his childhood years were soon disrupted, leaving behind the idyllic upper middle class. In January 1886, his father passed away unexpectedly from a brain hemorrhage when he was just 15 years old. Vladimir was greatly affected by this event, leading to a shift in his behavior towards being more reactionary and rebellious. In the next year, things got even more tangled. Vladimir's older brother Alexander, who had gone off to St. Petersburg State University, got caught up in a plot to assassinate the ruler of the Russian Empire, Alexander III. Not long after, Alexander and a few others were executed for their part in the conspiracy. This event greatly influenced Vladimir, pushing him towards extremist politics in Russia. Understanding Vladimir's and Alexander's actions in 1887 requires examining Russia's political landscape in the late 19th century. Russia has historically been somewhat separate from the mainstream of European politics and culture. Yet, under Peter the Run's rule in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Russia underwent substantial modernization and reform to bring it in line with other European nations such as France and the Austrian Empire. Catherine the Great continued this work. With her German background, she had a clear vision of modernizing Russia. In the late 18th century, Russian explorers and colonists made notable progress during the expansion of the Russian Empire. Russia extended its territory to the Pacific Ocean by reaching the Bering Straits and Manchuria. Meanwhile, Catherine embarked on a series of conquests in the West, which led to Russian rule over parts of the Caucasus, Poland, and Ukraine. Nevertheless, there were still several areas where the country fell behind. In Russia, the system of serfdom was deeply rooted, where commoners were tied to the land and their manorial lord in a manner resembling slavery. The economy was mainly rural, with the Orthodox Church exerting considerable influence over society. The czars and nobility acted in their self-interest as the country was under strict authoritarian rule. In the 19th century, the Russian Empire seemed to fall behind politically and socially compared to countries like the United States, Britain, and France. Events that occurred before Vladimir's birth and during his upbringing exacerbated these problems. Alexander II assumed the role of Tsar of Russia in 1855. His goal was to bring modernization to Russia and introduce liberal reforms. In 1861, he ended serfdom and liberated the serfs of Russia, which was a major social reform of the 19th century. Additionally, he sought to enhance the courts, policing, and education system. In 1866, he barely avoided an assassination attempt, causing a change in his political beliefs. Nevertheless, the reforms he had put into place had resulted in unexpected outcomes in Russia. Writers like Fyodor Dostoevsky, Pyotr Kropotkin, and Mikhail Bulgakov played a major role in challenging Russian society and delving into ideas and political theories such as anarchism, nihilism, and communism. Their works created an atmosphere that encouraged open discussions of new ideas. Consequently, numerous Russians sought further societal reforms, such as the creation of a parliament and the end of autocratic rule by the Tsars. Political terrorist groups such as the Narodniks and the People's Will emerged to advocate for these changes. The People's Will assassinated Alexander II in 1881, which led to a rise in dissatisfaction. Alexander III, who took over from his father, was against the reforms and sought to quash any liberal opposition in Russia. As a result, political unrest and instability pervaded the 1880s environment in which Vladimir grew up. Vladimir started his studies at Kazan University in 1887, amidst a politically charged atmosphere. He swiftly joined a protest against the government's crackdown on student societies perceived as hubs of political dissent. He was arrested briefly and then expelled from the university. Yet, his time there ignited his fascination with political radicalization. Vladimir enthusiastically delved into the writings of various Russian and European political authors, eagerly consuming their texts. He developed a keen interest in the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, renowned German political philosophers and social critics. In their 1848 pamphlet, The Communist Manifesto, they expressed strong criticism of the direction industrial society was taking. They proposed replacing bourgeois capitalist society with a system where the industrial proletariat collectively owned all aspects of society. Vladimir found this especially attractive during a time of rapid industrialization in Russian cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kazan, and Samara. Although his political views were already radical before he turned 20, they were still developing at the time due to the influence of other intellectuals. In 1890, Vladimir's mother used her family's connections in the Russian education system to help him take exams at the University of St. Petersburg instead of completing his studies at Kazan University. After graduating with top honors, he worked as a legal assistant in Samara during the 1890s. Throughout the years, he consistently fostered his political radicalism and actively engaged in different political organizations. In 1891, events caused a surge of radicalism in Russia's political landscape. Following a dry autumn, the nation experienced a very cold winter with some areas along the river Volga experiencing temperatures below 30 degrees Celsius. The harvest failures in Russia in 1892 were due to a dry spring and summer. After the famine, the response from the government of Tsar Alexander III and other influential figures in Russian society, including the Orthodox Church, only made the situation worse. The famine, which ended in late 1892, claimed the lives of over 350,000 people due to starvation. Many more people experienced malnutrition or other severe consequences. In Russia, the government faced growing criticism, leading to a rise in support for radical groups such as the Communists and Nihilists. Lenin left provincial Samara and traveled to the capital, St. Petersburg, in 1893, in response to the increasing political radicalism in Russian society. While working as a legal assistant, he dedicated himself to promoting the Marxist and communist movements in the city. Advocacy groups for social revolution were heavily suppressed during Alexander III's reign. However, his death in 1894 resulted in his son Nicholas II becoming the new ruler. Although Nicholas II was somewhat more liberal than his father, the political atmosphere remained oppressive. After arriving in the capital, Vladimir promptly joined a communist cell made up mostly of members from the Technological Institute of St. Petersburg. They chose the name Social Democrats, drawing inspiration from the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which held Marxist and communist beliefs. Vladimir attracted the attention of the secret police in St. Petersburg during the spring of 1894. He had become a well-known figure among Marxists. Nevertheless, his political views became increasingly radical in the following months, particularly after he formed a relationship with Nadezhda Krupskaya, a like-minded schoolteacher. By then, he had also begun secretly distributing Marxist pamphlets in the city. In 1895, he and his associates were arrested for their involvement in an activity. They were on the verge of releasing a newspaper called The Workers' Cause, with a communist agenda. Lenin was not allowed to have a lawyer present during his arrest, and he was held in custody for over a year before being sentenced. While serving his sentence in jail, he began writing a book titled The Development of Capitalism in Russia. He was sentenced to 3 years in exile in Siberia in 1896, a harsh and desolate region of Russia beyond the Ural Mountains. Exile to Siberia served as a means for the Russian state to remove political threats by sending them to a distant and sparsely populated region, rather than being viewed as a prison sentence. Nadia married him shortly after joining him there in 1898. Nadia couldn't have children due to her medical complications. Vladimir continued to write during this time, and eventually published The Development of Capitalism in Russia in 1899, under the pseudonym Vladimir Ilin. Following the conclusion of his exile in the early spring of 1900, he was denied permission to go back to St. Petersburg. Instead, he briefly stayed in Pskov, a city south of the capital. Vladimir joined the publication of a new newspaper called Iskra, which had a revolutionary message. Nevertheless, he quickly came to the realization that if he continued his operations in Russia, he would be arrested again and subjected to a more severe punishment. Consequently, he opted to visit Switzerland during the summer of 1900, where he formed alliances with revolutionary factions. Afterwards, he relocated to Munich in the German Empire, and Nadia joined him in 1901. He began writing under the name Lenin, which would later become closely associated with him. They moved again in 1902, this time to London. Lenin oversaw Iskra's operations from afar, ensuring the paper's covert distribution in Russia. Lenin penned his renowned work, What is to be Done? He spent his time in exile in London. The establishment was founded in 1902. He had a different perspective on the common communist belief regarding the working class's role in transitioning society from socialism to communism. Advocates of this viewpoint maintained that communist parties should lead that process. Lenin believed in a more hands-on approach to ensure the victory of communism over capitalism, even if it meant resorting to armed struggle. Working conditions and other factors fueled a growing desire for a socialist state among workers in countries such as Russia, Germany, and Britain. He contended that without a guiding revolutionary movement, their transition toward socialism and communism would not occur. Lenin believed that achieving this goal in one nation would enable the state to play a vital role in advancing the international communist movement. Lenin viewed the Russian communist movement as the primary driving force for the proletariat, leading them towards communism in Russia and eventually Europe. Yet, there was a possible risk linked to this viewpoint. If the Russian communist movement was responsible for promoting communism, both domestically and internationally, could all their actions be justified as necessary for the greater good of communism? During Lenin's time in London, an important chapter unfolded in the early history of the Russian communist movement. In 1898, while Lenin was exiled to Siberia, the different revolutionary cells and groups of Russian communism united to establish the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, or RSDLP. This event took place at an underground conference in Minsk in March 1898. Shortly after its formation, the party caught the attention of the Russian secret police, the Okhrana, leading to the arrest and imprisonment of several of its leaders. As a result, the decision was made to hold the RSDLP's Second Party Congress abroad, which occurred in 1903. Yet, as the delegates gathered in London, at a chapel on Tottenham Court Road in August, differences of opinion swiftly arose. Julius Martov headed a faction that advocated for a party membership that would appeal to a diverse range of individuals in Russia. That's because, back then, industrial workers were a small fraction of the population. The Lenin-led group, on the other hand, believed that only devoted revolutionaries should be members. In November, the party experienced division after a vote was taken on the issue. The Mensheviks were the opposing faction, and Lenin's group became known as the Bolsheviks. It's worth noting that the Bolsheviks were the smaller faction, despite the interesting fact that the term Bolshevik means majority and Menshevik means minority. The reason for this is that most of the editorial board of Iskra voted in favor of Lenin's faction. The split between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks did not result in the immediate creation of two distinct political parties. Two factions arose in the RSDLP. Despite their intense animosity, Lenin made the rift between them worse. In 1904, he published a treatise called One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, in which he strongly criticized the Mensheviks. In early 1905, the Bolsheviks had made significant progress and were gaining control over the Central Committee of the RSDLP. During the early months of 1905, important events occurred in Russia, making the timing favorable. In January, a sizable group of workers marched to the Tsar's Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. They aimed to peacefully deliver a petition advocating for improved workers' rights in Russian factories. Due to the excessive use of force by the government during the incident that later came to be known as Bloody Sunday, over 150 people tragically lost their lives and hundreds more suffered injuries. Russia experienced a revolution in 1905. Strikes erupted in multiple cities, army mutinies occurred, and unrest spread in rural areas. The Revolution of 1905 was the event that prompted Lenin to come back to Russia after being away for 5 years. He arrived promptly in St. Petersburg and played a crucial part in establishing a communist newspaper called Novaya Жизнь, meaning new life. He emphasized the need to grow the RSDLP membership during a time of intense revolutionary fervor in Russia. Unfortunately, it appeared that the party had already missed the chance. In October 1905, Tsar Nicholas II issued a document known as the October Manifesto. He made significant concessions to the many protesters throughout Russia. The manifesto detailed the extension of civil rights to Russian citizens, a concept already in place in other European nations. The creation of a new Russian parliament, called the Duma, was also promised, where political parties could elect members to this legislative assembly. The political crisis was resolved, and the revolution of 1905 came to a close. Unfortunately, Nicholas ultimately did not keep most of his promises. Following the creation of a state Duma, Nicholas decided to dissolve the initial one elected in 1906, citing concerns over the radical nature of its members. In addition, Dumas was found to be ineffective and conservative in his approach to governing bodies. Afterwards, martial law was quickly imposed in 1906, resulting in a crackdown on political opposition across Russia in the following years. Amidst the political crackdown in 1906 and 1907, Lenin and the Bolsheviks thoroughly evaluated their options. The revolution of 1905 proved to be underwhelming. Joseph Stalin, a prominent figure in the Georgian branch of the communist movement, led a faction that proposed conducting a terror campaign to target state institutions. This approach would also help in raising funds for the RSDLP. Despite some opposition, Lenin did not fully reject this idea. He successfully evaded the crackdown and entered the Grand Duchy of Finland, a semi-autonomous region within the Russian Empire, in early 1906. In 1906, the Bolsheviks enjoyed a period of increased freedom to operate. They easily distributed their printed material to St. Petersburg and Moscow from the nearby Finnish border. It was clear that we needed to go back to the strategies used from 1900 to 1905. Once more, the RSDLP leaders would be forced to go into exile, this time relocating to Western countries such as Britain, where their activities were better received compared to the autocratic East. Lenin came back to London in 1907, and the Bolsheviks took charge of the RSDLP again at the party's 5th Congress that summer, by defeating the Menshevik faction. Lenin and Nadia moved the party's headquarters to Paris in 1908 after relocating there. Lenin conducted research in the British Museum in London for several months before the move, specifically during the summer of 1908. His book Materialism and Empirio-Criticism was based on this research. Lenin's stay in cities such as Stockholm, Copenhagen, Prague, and Krakow after leaving Paris was also temporary. His usual stay duration was a few months. His influence with the RSDLP declined during this period, as some factions within the party began to favor participating in parliamentary politics in Russia. Yet, it was evident that the State Duma, created by Tsar Nicholas II in 1905, was nothing more than a facade, providing only the illusion of parliamentary representation in the country. Furthermore, the health of both him and Nadia was declining. Lenin's health problems have been linked to either acute atherosclerosis or neurosyphilis. His illness, regardless of its cause, began to pose challenges during his exile years, as his influence waned within the Russian communist movement. In 1912, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks officially split into two separate political parties. Lenin was allowed to regain his prominence in the Bolshevik Party and revive the Russian communist movement due to an unexpected turn of events. This opportunity presented itself due to the outbreak of a European war. The major European powers had been experiencing growing tensions for years. The German Empire's rise posed a challenge to British supremacy, with additional strain from colonial and regional rivalries. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans also added to the already tense political situation. Russia was concerned about the issue because it wanted to become the dominant regional power after the Turks, competing with the Empire of Austria-Hungary. Thus, when a regional crisis arose in the summer of 1914, it swiftly developed into a conflict between Russia and Austria-Hungary. Germany swiftly allied with Austria-Hungary, while the British and the French immediately declared war on Berlin and Vienna to support their Russian ally. The First World War started. Russia is poised for a major transformation. In late July 1914, Lenin found himself in Galicia, a region that is currently part of Poland and Ukraine, but was under the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the early 1900s. The Austro-Hungarian government briefly imprisoned him due to his Russian citizenship. Nevertheless, he swiftly displayed his disapproval of the Tsarist regime under Nicholas II, leading to his release. They later traveled to Switzerland, where they spent 2 years during the ongoing war in Europe. In 1917, he published Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, continuing his writing and theorizing. At this time, Lenin's political ideas were changing, and he was prepared to break away from traditional Marxism. This was a departure that not many communist thinkers were willing to make in the 1910s. He disagreed with Marx's idea that societies need to transition from autocracy to bourgeois democracy before achieving a socialist revolution and communism. Lenin proposed in Switzerland during the mid-1910s that Russia could transition directly from autocracy to a socialist revolution without the need for a bourgeois democracy to first emerge. Russia intends to carry out a comparable experiment soon. As Lenin's political thought was taking shape in the peaceful Alpine region, Russia's war effort was not going well. The Russian army had ineffective leadership and insufficient training, while the German Imperial Army on the Eastern Front was known for its exceptional military skills. The situation became even more complex when Tsar Nicholas II chose to personally lead the army. In 1916, Russia achieved significant gains, especially through the Brest-Litovsk offensive. This offensive resulted in the capture of a significant portion of territory in Poland. In addition, Romania's involvement in the war alongside Britain, France, and Russia greatly aided the Russian war effort in the Balkans. By year-end, Russia experienced increasing food shortages and social unrest caused by the war's impact on supply lines and scarcity. Many people were unhappy with the Tsarist government because they were concerned about Grigory Rasputin's increasing influence on the imperial family. Rasputin was a mystic and claimed to be a holy man. On February 23, 1917, protests broke out in St. Petersburg, formerly known as Petrograd, and later spread to other cities in Russia. In the next week, the Tsarist government's control over the country weakened. By early March, it was clear that the military no longer wanted to intervene decisively to support Nicholas II. With his family stuck in Petrograd and facing opposition from troops as he tried to come back from the Eastern Front, the Tsar finally listened to the advice of army chiefs and senior members of the Duma. He gave up the throne on March 3, 1917. The February Revolution succinctly ended the 300-year rule of the Romanov dynasty in Russia. Lenin in Switzerland soon learned about the unfolding events in his homeland. After spending many years in exile, he was preparing to return to Russia in just a few days. His influence within the Bolshevik movement increased during the war due to his conviction that the communist movement should abstain from participating in the conflict. On the contrary, he viewed it as a conflict between capitalists and imperialist regimes. The German government assisted him in his return to Russia by arranging a sealed train, along with several other Russian dissidents. They journeyed from the Swiss-German border to the North Sea. The German government thought that Lenin's presence might disrupt Russia's politics and potentially help their war effort on the Eastern Front. In March, the company reached the Baltic Sea. They took a ferry to Sweden and then continued their journey by land, heading north through Sweden and into Finland. On their journey, they received updates about the recent events in Petrograd. The liberal aristocracy and centrist revolutionaries appeared to have combined their influence on the State Duma to form a temporary government. Yet, the new regime encountered immediate challenges as the Russian lines on the Eastern Front collapsed due to growing desertions and ineffective leadership. Thus, when Lenin arrived in Petrograd on April 16, 1917, the new regime was already encountering difficulties. He quickly worked to bolster the Bolshevik cause, addressing large gatherings of workers in the city throughout the late spring and early summer. Upon his return to Russia, he distributed the April Theses, which outlined his vision for a new government centered on workers' councils called Soviets. Tensions continued to rise and reached their highest point in mid-July. During this period, known as the July Days, workers and soldiers took part in violent demonstrations against the government. The protests were instigated by Bolshevik agitation. After the July Days, the provisional government acted to suppress the Bolsheviks. Lenin and his supporters sought refuge in the semi-autonomous Grand Duchy of Finland. Other senior members of the party, like Leon Trotsky, a promising theorist and organizer, were captured in Petrograd. In the autumn of 1917, Lenin and his followers began plotting a counter-revolution in Russia to overthrow the provisional government. Additional factions within the Russian army and navy were also devising comparable actions against the provisional government. The government's management of the war and inability to stabilize the domestic situation had left them in a risky position. In autumn, Russia faced a tense political situation when General Laver Kornilov, the commander-in-chief of the Russian military, attempted a military takeover. To resolve this problem, the provisional government had to turn to the communists and their workers' Soviets in Petrograd for help. This ultimately strengthened the position of the Bolsheviks. Lenin made his way back to the capital in early October, where Leon Trotsky had been chosen as the leader of the Petrograd Soviet Union. At this point, the Bolsheviks had effectively outmaneuvered their rivals, the Mensheviks, in the Russian communist movement. In the State Duma, this group had a strong presence and collaborated closely with the provisional government from March onwards. In contrast, the Bolsheviks were renowned for their unwavering stance since the 1900s, which they skillfully utilized to their benefit. Thus, when Lenin arrived back in Petrograd in October, the stage was set for the Bolsheviks to make their last bid for power in Russia. Many people consider the coup in Petrograd on November 7, 1917, or October 25, in the Julian calendar that Russia was using at the time, to be a significant event in modern world history. The October Revolution is widely recognized and celebrated by the communist movement. It was the outcome of a brief period of planning by Lenin, Trotsky, and others in Petrograd in early and mid-October. Armed militias were prepared in Petrograd, Moscow, and other cities to respond to the government. The provisional government knew about the planned actions, but despite their attempts to shut down Petrograd on October 24th, they couldn't stop the movement. Lenin and Trotsky quickly encouraged the Military Revolutionary Committee and the Soviets to take over government buildings on October 25th. The Bolsheviks had gained control over most of Petrograd and Moscow by the end of the day. The following day, the Bolshevik Red Guards, also known as their revolutionary soldiers, entered the Winter Palace in Petrograd and successfully removed the provisional government from power. In Petrograd, on the evening of October 26th, a Congress of Russia's workers' councils, known as the Soviets, occurred. A new socialist government was declared on October 27, following the conclusion of this Congress. The discussion of a communist state was initially limited to avoid alienating the majority of the Russian population, who were mainly agrarian agricultural workers. That's basically what was established in late October of 1917. Shortly after, the revolutionaries started sharing their perspectives and plans with the wider political community in Russia. The empire covered a vast expanse of land, stretching from Europe's Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean and from the Arctic Circle to the deserts of Central Asia. It consisted of people from different countries and ethnic backgrounds, including Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Georgians, Finns, Latvians, Estonians, Lithuanians, Moldovans, Kazakhs, Turkmen, Armenians, and the indigenous peoples of Siberia beyond the Ural Mountains. The Declaration of the Rights of the Peoples of Russia was issued on November 2, 1917, soon after the Bolsheviks gained control in Petrograd. The main goal was to reassure all the people of Russia that the new government would prioritize their best interests. This statement affirms the equality and independence of all ethnic groups under Russian jurisdiction, granting them the right to determine their future. It also removed religious and national privileges in line with Marxist ideology. The letter, which Lenin and Joseph Stalin both signed, emphasizes the idealism of the Bolshevik Revolution in its early stages. The declaration made it evident that the Russian Empire would no longer support its previous reputation for imperialism. The people under the Tsars had the power to shape their political destiny. Within months, the communist regime would begin to completely reverse this commitment. The creation of a one-party state did not happen automatically after the October Revolution. Before the revolution, the provisional government had made arrangements to conduct elections for the establishment of a new constituent assembly. In early 1918, the Bolsheviks implemented this plan. Other elements within the revolutionary movement in Russia, including the Mensheviks and other leftist and revolutionary groups, also had a claim to power. In January 1918, a Russian constituent assembly was held. Events were unfolding quickly as the Bolsheviks, who would later become the Russian Communist Party, aimed to take full control. Over time, the workers' councils, or Soviets, grew increasingly powerful in cities like Petrograd and Moscow. Meanwhile, the Russian Communist Party's political bureau, also known as the Politburo, maintained centralized control. The party launched a targeted campaign to oust Mensheviks and other socialist and revolutionary members from the Soviet Union and other political bodies. In 1918, the Russian Communist Party effectively turned Russia into a single-party state under their control. Lenin became the leader of the new communist state during this important year. He played a crucial role as the chair of Sovnarkom, the governing body that oversaw the Soviets or workers' councils throughout Russia on behalf of the Russian Communist Party. It eventually became an important part of the developing Soviet Union government. In 1918, the roles and titles of the chairs of Sovnarkom were still developing, eventually becoming the official head of state. Lenin not only chaired Sovnarkom but also held positions on the Politburo and the Council of Labor and Defense. As a result, Lenin moved to the Kremlin in Moscow, the previous location of the government, before Tsar Peter III transferred it to St. Petersburg in the 18th century. Unfortunately, there was a drawback to this. In 1918, there were 3 notable assassination attempts, which emphasized the continued political instability. Lenin was shot twice on the morning of August 30, 1918, resulting in severe injuries including blood entering his lungs. His health declined rapidly after a long period of weakness. In 1918, the government underwent a reorganization to establish a country governed by the Politburo, Sovnarkom, and the Soviets. Alongside this, the Communist Party began implementing major economic reforms based on Marxist ideology. The new government acted quickly and decisively by issuing a decree on land on the 8th of November 1917, just 2 weeks after the October Revolution. The transfer of land ownership in Russia from the old Russian nobility and the Orthodox Church to the state was announced in this statement. The land would be distributed among the peasantry based on communist ideology. Later, Lenin and others would discuss the best agricultural policy to use, Lenin was in favor of state-run collective farms, but it took some time for this matter to be resolved. In the cities, the Soviets gained control of major industries and factories by bringing them under state ownership. Further rules were introduced to overhaul the labor laws as well. For instance, the workday was limited to 8 hours, which was a major advancement for workers' rights. This decision was a significant step forward, taking into account the efforts of workers in different European countries, like Britain and Germany, who have been pushing for shorter working hours, which used to be as long as 14 or 12 hours. In addition to economic and property reforms, Lenin's government introduced a series of laws in late 1917 and 1918 to reshape Russia's social and legal framework. Communist ideology rejected religion as an example. In January 1918, the new government issued a decree to establish a clear separation between church and state. During that period, Christian churches in Europe maintained considerable sway over education and other social matters. The new communist state promptly addressed the issue by providing free education for all. In early 20th century Russia, a notable development occurred in the realm of education, despite limited access to it in the country. An initiative was started to tackle the widespread problem of illiteracy. State ownership rapidly expanded to encompass various sectors of Russian society, such as banking, transport, trade, and communications. A new legal system, presided over by people's courts, quickly replaced the old czarist one. This system differed from other European judicial systems and common law courts in Britain because it included a judge and 2 assessors. They served as jurors in the common law system, but had greater powers, including the ability to make decisions in conjunction with the judge. In addition to these economic and social reforms, there was also the urgent issue of the ongoing war. In 1917, the Russian war effort on the Eastern Front faced numerous challenges. Amidst mass desertion and Russian military commanders' reluctance to fight, the German Empire achieved significant advances across a wide front spanning from the Baltic Sea to Poland and Ukraine. The government under Lenin quickly acknowledged that Russia couldn't leave the conflict without losing some territory. To end Russia's participation in what Lenin had consistently criticized as a capitalist and imperialist war, negotiations with Berlin were promptly initiated. 4 months after the October Revolution in March 1918, Russia and the Central Powers, under the leadership of Germany, signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Under the terms of the agreement, Russia gave up control of its territories in the Baltic States region, Poland and Ukraine. Germany gained control over a significant portion of Russian territory in Poland, while the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia achieved independence as German-influenced states. Ukraine and Finland gained independence as new states emerged. Furthermore, Russia ceded territory to the Ottoman Empire, a key ally of Germany. The peace agreement imposed severe terms on Russia, leading to the loss of valuable agricultural land, industrial cities, and densely populated areas from the Russian Empire. Nevertheless, by accepting it, the emerging communist state decided to withdraw from the war with Germany to concentrate on consolidating its power in Russia. In 1918, Lenin's government desperately sought peace with Germany and the other Central Powers. The revolution they initiated in October 1917 encountered resistance from different groups within Russia, resulting in a nationwide civil war. The new regime faced opposition from the White Army, which was in contrast to the Red Army of the Soviet regime. Yet, the term whites referred to a diverse group of counter-revolutionaries who opposed the new regime. They were made up of the former Russian aristocracy and the Orthodox Church, which were suddenly stripped of their wealth and influence in Russia. Within the whites were factions in the Russian army and navy that opposed the communist takeover. Some centrists and leftists joined the counter-revolution when it became clear that the Bolsheviks would have complete control and that democratic communism would not be established in Lenin's Russia. An unconventional alliance fighting the Bolsheviks in 1918 managed to capture a sizable portion of Russia. The Russian Civil War posed major challenges for Lenin's government. This occurred as a result of events taking place in another location. By late autumn 1918, the First World War was nearing its end, with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire facing internal collapse. The war came to an end on November 11, 1918, with Germany's surrender. Kaiser Wilhelm II had already abdicated his throne by then. Following the resolution of the global conflict, the victorious powers such as Britain, France, the United States, and Japan were committed to overthrowing the newly established communist state in Russia. The major powers in London and Paris were firmly against a radical socialist government gaining control of one of Europe's most influential states. In late 1918, Britain and other nations began providing extensive support to the White Army. Several countries, including Britain, sent forces to Russia. In addition, Poland, with Western aid, entered into a war with Russia. In 1918 and 1919, the early stages of the Civil War presented major obstacles for Lenin's government. There were worries about the new regime's longevity. When evaluating the early development of the Soviet state, it's crucial to take into account the significant challenges it faced in 1918 and 1919. To maintain control over the remaining Soviet territory, Lenin and his closest associates, including Trotsky and Stalin, used state terror as a means of survival amidst numerous threats. In December 1917, Lenin issued a directive to establish the Emergency Commission for combating counter-revolution and sabotage. The Cheka, also known as the Initial Secret Police Service of the Soviet state, was established during its 74-year history. The Cheka's role was to identify and eliminate individuals deemed as counter-revolutionaries or enemies of the state. Felix Dzerzhinsky, the leader, was given broad powers to accomplish this task. Shortly after, many people who were seen as enemies of the government were arrested and executed without any legal process. Several individuals were detained and transported to labor camps located in the harsh and isolated regions of Siberia. Lenin tried to separate himself from the Red Terror, but it's clear that he led the Soviet state during a time when the harsh elements of the Tsarist regime re-emerged to create a security state that would shape Soviet Russia for the next 70 years. The Red Terror was a part of the measures taken by the early Soviet state to suppress the Civil War and establish its authority. Another aspect involved using blocking units in the war effort. Leon Trotsky was a major influence on the concept, which involved using Red Army units to shoot Soviet soldiers retreating from behind the front lines. These methods, while harsh, quickly proved to be effective. In 1918, the war effort encountered difficulties during the summer and autumn. An expeditionary force from Britain and France arrived at Arkhangelsk on the White Sea, while the war against Germany was still ongoing. In the meantime, a group of Czech and Slovak soldiers successfully entered Russia and took control of the city of Kazan. In addition, the Japanese attacked Vladivostok, the primary eastern port. Later, Trotsky effectively organized the Red Army. Kazan was recaptured in September 1918, followed by the retaking of Samara in October. Regrettably, these efforts were compromised when the newly independent Poland declared war in November. Yet, the first attack in 1918 by the Western powers and their proxies failed to defeat the communist state. In addition, after the First World War, the Entente powers faced distractions due to conflicts that broke out in Ireland, Turkey, and other regions. The Red Army launched an offensive in 1919. The Communists recaptured Kyiv in early February, regaining control over Ukraine that they had lost before due to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. In April, troops from Britain, France, and America had to withdraw from Ukraine. Russian forces gained control of the port of Odessa, further establishing communist rule in Ukraine. The British and French expeditionary forces near Arkhangelsk and Murmansk by the White Sea were evacuated in August. Later, the Western powers mainly fought the Soviets indirectly by backing their allies in the White Army, Poland, and nearby nations. Nonetheless, a limited American and Japanese presence remained in the far east of the country. Meanwhile, the war in the West shifted to Russia's conflict with Poland. In early 1920, the Poles achieved a breakthrough by capturing Kyiv. Nevertheless, when a Soviet counteroffensive became a danger to Warsaw, Both parties reached an armistice in the autumn. Lenin's regime had largely triumphed in the Russian Civil War by the close of 1920. Nevertheless, operations continued in different locations until the recapture of the port of Vladivostok in October 1922, signaling the war's conclusion. Trotsky assumed leadership of the Red Army from Lenin during the Civil War. Instead, he focused on developing a new perspective on international socialism and communism during the late 1910s. In 1918, the British Labour Party addressed the request for a fresh international conference of socialist parties. The proposed name was Labour and Socialist International. However, the Russian leader became disillusioned with the moderate socialist movements that were prevalent in Western Europe during his exile. His objective was to establish a brand new, Soviet-led global socialist movement. The first Congress of the Communist International, also known as the Comintern, occurred in Moscow in March 1919. There was optimism for a global socialist revolution, as communist uprisings had occurred in Germany and Hungary before the first Comintern. Yet, these uprisings were swiftly suppressed, and as Lenin aged, he probably recognized the unlikelihood of an immediate revolution to overthrow the global capitalist system. However, the creation of the Comintern was extremely important because it later developed into a powerful tool for global communism under the Soviet Union's leadership. One final policy of the Soviet regime under Lenin is worth noting. In 1921, as the Civil War was ending, the Soviet leader implemented the new economic policy. Lenin's shift in direction was a departure from his usual unwavering commitment to Marxist ideology. His plans for a new economic system in Russia, which would keep the capitalist free market running, came as a surprise to many. Russians were permitted to own limited amounts of land and businesses, while major industries and large agricultural estates remained under state ownership. The objective of the new economic policy was to stabilize the Russian economy post-war and foster growth amidst a period of intense famine. Ultimately, the Russian economy greatly benefited from the new economic policy. The country saw substantial growth after the war by adopting private ownership and free trade. Nevertheless, the new economic policy was gradually phased out in the 1920s as the state assumed more responsibility for managing industry and implementing farm collectivization. It's important to examine how Lenin's political thought should be interpreted, particularly in light of the transition to the new economic policy in the early 1920s. This represented a notable shift away from classical Marxism. Nevertheless, Lenin had been open to diverging from the ideas of the 19th-century German political theorist for a while. By the 1920s, Leninism had emerged as a unique form of communist ideology. Leninism had a major influence on communist regimes globally throughout the 20th century. Leninism suggested that a socialist revolution could happen without the requirement of a prior establishment of a bourgeois democracy and capitalist system. It suggested that a sizable urban proletariat could carry out the socialist revolution, resulting in the establishment of a communist state. Lenin supported a dictatorship of the proletariat, regardless of the size of the state. He thought that society should be led towards socialism and communism by a vanguard party of the proletariat. This development is highly significant. It is unlikely that communism would have emerged in countries like China, Mongolia, or Angola, as they have limited industrialization and a lack of a significant urban working class. Nevertheless, Leninism had a profound impact on the 20th century by promoting the idea of a small group of workers guiding a nation towards communism. Regrettably, Lenin did not live long enough to witness any of these events. His health deteriorated in the 1910s, but the exact cause of his illness remains a mystery. It experienced a significant decline following a series of assassination attempts in 1918, particularly when he was shot twice and suffered serious injuries that autumn. In the late 1910s and early 1920s, many doctors were consulted to address his health issues. There were concerns about his health because the bullets from the assassination attempt were never taken out, possibly causing blood poisoning. In April 1922, he underwent surgery to have them removed. However, the procedure did not result in any improvement. In the early 1920s, he was stuck in Moscow because of various symptoms. Some of the symptoms reported were difficulty sleeping, heightened sensitivity to noise and other triggers, headaches, feeling nauseous, and overall tiredness. He experienced his first stroke in the summer of 1922, then several more in quick succession. Consequently, he suffered from partial paralysis and became increasingly dependent on a wheelchair. As Lenin's health declined in the early 1920s, there was increasing worry about his successor and the future leadership of the newly formed USSR in the event of his death or incapacity. Lenin's influence in the Soviet state was not that of an absolute dictator, but rather the result of his experience and intellectual leadership during his years in exile. There was a chance that no one would take his place, and instead, the Politburo would collectively govern the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, Lenin himself had doubts about the practicality of such an arrangement and expressed the idea that another prominent leader would step in. During his illness in the winter of 1922, he dictated his final testament. He talked about the qualities of the potential candidates. Joseph Stalin, a prominent figure, held the position of General Secretary of the Communist Party during that time. Nevertheless, Lenin had become wary of the Georgian he had first encountered 17 years prior, during the Revolution of 1905. He thought the person was too ambitious and not intellectually prepared. Lenin chose Leon Trotsky to be his successor. He demonstrated his clarity by dictating his final testament. Lenin suffered another stroke in March 1923, which resulted in the loss of his ability to speak. Later, his health worsened and he fell into a coma in early 1924. He died on January 21st. The political jockeying to replace Lenin began promptly. Regrettably, Trotsky was unable to attend Lenin's state funeral in Moscow on January 27th, as he was recovering from an illness in the Caucasus region. This was due to incorrect information provided by Stalin. For a century, Lenin's body has been embalmed and is on public display in a mausoleum in Red Square, Moscow. After Lenin's death, several high-ranking members of the Soviet regime and the Politburo expressed their backing for Stalin, despite Lenin's warnings. Stalin joined forces with Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, two high-ranking members of the Politburo. Stalin used this alliance to undermine Trotsky in the following years. He eventually compelled him to leave the country and later turned against his former comrades. By 1929, Stalin had established his authority and assumed the role of a dictator, surpassing the level of control Lenin had ever attained. He maintained complete control over the Soviet Union for the next 25 years, causing the deaths of millions in his pursuit of power. Lenin, also known as Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, was a significant figure in the 20th century. In the early 1900s, he chose the pen name Lenin. He grew up in a privileged family, but strongly resisted his upbringing from an early age. The rebellion began when his brother was executed by the oppressive Tsarist regime in the late 1880s. Over the next 25 years, he became a leading intellectual figure in the Bolshevik movement. He formulated theories on implementing communism in Russia that expanded upon Marx's ideas. Therefore, in 1917, amidst the First World War, a communist state emerged in Russia, and he took charge. He stated that the Russian proletariat and the communists, although a minority in the Russian Empire, would lead the way in spreading communism in Russia and worldwide. The Russian Revolution arose from a desire for change and the goal of dismantling the centuries-old autocratic, imperial rule that governed Russia. Nevertheless, Soviet Russia, similar to other nation-states, struggled to fully separate itself from its past. After the Bolsheviks gained control, they set up a communist state that had notable resemblances to the previous Tsarist regime. The Cheka was created to replace the Okhrana, the secret police during the Tsarist era, and operated covertly as a police force. Once again, political dissidents are being sent to labor camps and exile in Siberia, just like in imperial times. Regrettably, Aspirations for a democratic legislative assembly in the new communist state were quickly dashed as a dictatorship of the Soviets and the Politburo emerged, led by Lenin. Other communist leaders in Europe and Russia, such as Rosa Luxemburg and Peter Kropotkin, strongly opposed this. It's worth noting that Lenin and Joseph Stalin were distinct individuals, yet the state he helped create in the late 1910s and early 1920s had a powerful totalitarian regime, which ultimately led to Stalin's rise to power.